The Flea is a metaphysical poem and carpe diem poem written by Donne in the 1700s. And as you can see, we have a picture, an anatomy drawing of a flea. And you might think, why has a poet written about a flea? Well, being a metaphysical poet, Donne used inventive metaphors. And we shall see as we start going through the poem and looking at the context why the flea was so important. So, before we begin analysing the poem, let's look at the context. So, Donne was born in 1572 and lived until 1631. He was born to Roman Catholic parents, and at this time in England, it was actually illegal to be a Catholic. Donne did later convert to Anglicanism. For those of you who have done a little bit of study of the time period, you will know that there was a lot of religious conflict during England at this time. Donne studied law at Lincoln's Inn for 2 or more years in 1592, and he was an interesting character. In 1596 to 1597, he sailed as a gentleman adventurer with English expeditions to Cadiz and the Azores. So he liked to travel, and travel at this time was quite a big deal. There were no planes, there were no trains. It was travel by horse and carriage or ship. After his adventures abroad, he worked as a secretary for Sir Thomas Egerton, Lord Keeper of England. And in 1601, Donne's, love adventures, I guess you could say, really came to a head when he secretly married Anne More, the daughter of Sir George More, a parliamentary representative for Surrey. As a consequence, Donne was imprisoned, as in he was sent to prison. In 1602, he lost his job and didn't have regular employment until 12 years later. Now, that's quite a break from working. And he probably was a bit confused. His adventures, what he did, is not really known. But in 1615, Donne enters the church, also known as taking up holy orders, and he was encouraged by the king to take up holy orders. In 1617, Donne's wife died in childbirth, and then later in his life, this 10 years before he died, in 1621, Donne becomes Reverend Dr. Donne, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. And he became one of the most celebrated clerics of his age and preached frequently before the king at court. Now that's quite a feat for someone to be favoured by the king. So he had different stages of his life. He had the younger years of going adventuring, not really knowing what to do. He got married. Then he lost his job and didn't really have anything stable for 12 years. And then his last part of life was entering the church. And as you see here, there's a portrait of Donne as a young man, and that is circa 1595. Now, Donne's poetry had 3 stages. First, the young Donne, a lustful, cynical persona. And it was around this time that The Flea was written. Second, the courting or married lover, reflected by the Neoplatonic idea of transcendental love, like Sonnet 116, but also founded in physical. So his poetry at this point was much more romantic, but also grounded in the physical. And third, he was Dr. Donne, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, and he wrote a lot more religious poetry and prose. But the poem we're looking at is The Flea. And this is going to be, well, we're going to see perhaps the lustful, cynical persona of young John Donne in this poem. Now, the flea was an erotic symbol during this time period. So let's look a little bit more into this. So, in 1633, The Flea, the poem, was first published, and this is actually after John Donne's death. And we assume that the poem was written in the 1590s while John was a law student. Fleas at this time were featured in erotic poetry and inspired by the Roman poet Ovid's writings. And I will have one of Ovid's poems that we're going to look at in a minute. And you might think, well, why were fleas featured in erotic poetry? I mean, what makes them erotic? And during the Renaissance period, fleas were also a source of risque humour. So let us look at why on earth are fleas considered an erotic symbol at this time. Now, sex during the 1600s, they did not have the understanding of the human anatomy, nor the functionings of sex and biology like we have today. It was believed that blood mingled during sex, along with other bodily fluids. And fleas were common in real life. And they were found on the human bodies of all peoples, of all classes, and of both genders. So if we see here the painting at the side, it's called The Flea Hunt by a painter called Gerard van Honthurst, and was painted in 1621. Now, the flea hunt. So here we have a maid, perhaps helping a woman try and find the flea. And again, you might think, well, why is a flea an erotic symbol? That's disgusting. It's the sort of thing you get on cats and dogs and then you wash them because you want to get rid of them. Well, fleas were considered erotic because, well, perhaps they could go places on bodies that would otherwise not be seen. The question is, were men jealous of fleas? So, with this in mind, we need to think, well, how is this going to apply to John Donne's poem? Now, to look at the inspiration for using fleas, we have one of Ovid's poems, and this is Ovid's poem on fleas. So, O puny flea, yet a bitter plague harmful to girls, with what song shall I act against your deeds, fierce one? You lacerate a tender body, hard one, with your bite, which fills your skin with blood from her skin. You cause her body to send forth darkening stains, her smooth members with stains become moistened. And when you fasten your sharp prow into her side, the maiden is compelled to arise from her heavy sleep. While you wander along her curves, you can penetrate other members. You go wherever you please, nothing to you, savage one, is concealed. Oh, it pains me to tell, when the girl reclines spread out, you pluck at her thigh and go up into her open shanks. Sometimes you even dare to go through her loving member and arouse the pleasures born in those places. And this poem is as, what shall we say, pornographic as you might think it is. So this is the inspiration for the use of fleas. And perhaps when we are reading John Donne's poem, you can think, well, are there any similarities or differences between the use of fleas in the poetic language?